At first light, Kagumi and his men set out on the journey to the African village. The inflatable was halfway across the creek when the sound of rifle shots came from the direction of the Narrows. Kagumi realized they must have been fired by the sentries on the other side of the bluff. He opened the throttle wide and headed for the Narrows, the inflatable bumping and spraying its way across wind-rippled water. Once round the bluff, he saw the drifting catamaran, the body of an African slumped over the stern, blood oozing from his head, an arm thrown out over the outrigger. Two men with rifles stood at the water's edge. The bigger man answered. "He was paddling the catamaran out of the creek, sir. 3 times we shouted to him to stop, but he would not. When we fired a warning shot, he paddled faster, so we had to." He shrugged as if unwilling to complete the sentence. Kagumi accepted that it was nobody's fault. The sentries had obeyed orders. It was unfortunate that the villagers did not yet know that it was forbidden to put to sea. The warning shot must have caused the African to lose his nerve. Had he made a slightly later start, the incident could not have taken place. Unfortunate, decided Kagumi, but war was war. With the catamaran and its dead occupant towing astern, he steered towards the huts under the palm trees. Their inhabitants would realize now the importance of obeying the orders he was about to give them. On balance, he concluded, the incident was probably a good thing. He was sure that would be the view of Yashimoto, whom he could see standing under the leafy branches which concealed I-357's periscope standards. Yashimoto lowered his binoculars. It was evident what had happened. Not for the first time, he congratulated himself on having a first lieutenant as capable and quick-thinking as Kagumi. An excellent officer, he could always be relied upon to do the right thing at the right time. It was unfortunate that an African had been annihilated, but the example set would do no harm. Though the goodwill of the villagers was desirable, they could not be permitted to go out to sea. Once on the fishing grounds, they would meet other fishermen, and the news that a submarine was hiding in the creek would soon spread. The safety of I-357 and her crew had at all times to be paramount. A good deal happened on board in the next few hours. Kagumi returned with 2 catamarans in tow, an African in one of them. The catamarans were secured astern of the submarine, and the African was taken on board. "The villagers understand your orders, sir," Kagumi reported, though some of the women moaned and wailed when I handed over the body. A deprecatory laugh came from the first lieutenant. Trying to explain in sign language what had happened was not easy, but in the end the message got through. "The African you brought back?" inquired Yashimoto. "He can speak a dialect which is possibly English or South African. He has worked on the gold mines in South Africa near a place he called Goli. Apparently many Africans from Mozambique do so." Yashimoto permitted himself a rare smile. "How did sign language tell you that?" He pretended to dig, picked up a stone, held it against the gold-coloured anklets the women wore. He pointed to himself several times, said, "Goli, South Africa," and again went through the motions of digging. Kagumi paused. "After that," Yashimoto held up a peremptory hand. "That will do, First Lieutenant. Why did you bring him across?" "Hasumu was studying English at university in Yokohama before he was called up," explained Kagumi. "It is possible that he will understand the African. I thought that might be useful." The first lieutenant had difficulty in concealing a yawn. The gesture was not lost on Yashimoto. "You have done well, Kagumi," he said. "Now take a rest. It must be a long time since you slept." The inflatable with Sato and his crew got back to the submarine at 7:30 that morning. Yashimoto's concern at their late return was mollified by the quality of the chart the navigating officer had made. He was also much relieved by Sato's report that there were no signs of human habitation other than the huts in the creek. Looking at the chart, it struck Yashimoto that Creek Island was shaped like a wolf's head, the creek its mouth, the bluff the big fang which shut out the view from seaward. Perhaps he should have called it Wolf Island. "Later," he told Sato, "you must complete the chart with soundings in the creek and its approaches." The hills which enclosed the creek and the bluff which jutted into the Narrows not only hid the submarine from seaward, but provided shelter from the prevailing wind. The steep, wooded slopes rising up from the water's edge would, he realized, cast shadows over the creek through most of the day. An enemy warship attempting to enter must, on rounding the bluff, come within point-blank range of the submarine's forward torpedo tubes. Finally, the creek was so narrow, its sides so high, that bombing runs by aircraft would be difficult. For purposes of defense, decided Yashimoto, Creek Island could scarcely have been better. The disadvantages were that the hills and the leafy camouflage on the conning tower limited the function of the search receiver, while the hydrophones could only be effective over a restricted sector where the narrows led into the creek's basin. Distant warning of a ship approaching would be difficult at night. The advantages the island's geography conferred on the submarine were shared in quite different ways by the African fishing community. Small wonder, thought Yashimoto, that they had sited their huts where they were. A short time after sunrise that morning, the 7 sentries guarding the land approaches to I-357, and the petty officer and men from the inflatable on duty in the creek returned on board, having been relieved by personnel from the spare crew pool with Sub-Lieutenant Nikaido in command in place of Lieutenant Matsuhito. At about 8 o'clock, the operator on the sound receiver reported the approach of an aircraft on a southerly bearing. 3 short blasts were immediately sounded on the bridge siren, and all activity in I-357 ceased. In accordance with orders, the sentries at once took cover. Camouflaged with foliage, the inflatable at the creek entrance nosed into the bank to hide under overhanging branches. The atmosphere in the control room became tense, no one moving, many eyes looking at the deckhead as the distant drone increased in volume until it passed overhead in a crescendo of sound, only to become steadily fainter as the aircraft drew away. "Flying low," the captain spoke in a subdued voice. "No more than a few hundred feet, probably. If he does not circle and return soon, all is well." The first lieutenant nodded assent. During the next few minutes, tension in the control room slowly diminished. Yashimoto looked towards the cabinet where the sound operator sat, staring blankly, and his hands pressing the headphones to his ears. "Do you still hear it, Hasumu?" he demanded. The operator shook his head. "It has gone, sir." The captain turned to Kagumi. "Sound the carry-on. First lieutenant." The long, shrill blast of the siren travelled down the conning tower to the control room. Within 30 minutes, the performance was repeated. This time, the aircraft came in from the north and passed over the creek on a southerly heading. Again, it gave no indication of having sighted anything untoward. Whether it was the first aircraft returning or another, Yashimoto did not know. Because of the time and the direction from which it had come, he assumed its base was Kilindini. There was no means of telling. The sentry on duty beneath the foliage on the aftergun platform had reported that both aircraft were Catalinas. Wearing greasy, sweat-stained khaki shirt and shorts, the pouches under his tired eyes darker and more prominent than usual, Yashimoto addressed the officers and petty officers gathered in the control room. Their dishevelled, soiled appearance, their weary faces, matched those of their commanding officer. Standing well clear of the conning tower, from which came sounds of hammering and drilling, he began by explaining that strong tropical sunlight would by the end of the day have withered much of the submarine's leafy camouflage. "We will have to put fresh layers on top," he said, running his tongue across his lower lip. "This will mean another night of hard work, but we shall begin it well rested. Until midday, all men not otherwise employed will clean and tidy the boat. After so many weeks at sea, it is dirty and foul-smelling. This is not your fault. It is unavoidable on a long patrol. But now we have the opportunity to wash and brush up." The captain stopped, showed his teeth in a dry smile. The utter, the grease, the peelings, the food droppings and waste material, all must be collected and made ready for disposal tonight. Each compartment is to be scrubbed and washed down with seawater, then sprayed with disinfectant. Mess tins, plates, cutlery and mugs must be scoured and stowed away neatly. The filth, the untidiness, the foul smell in the boat must be gone by noon. After that. His voice was drowned by the high-pitched whine of an electric drill in the conning tower, where the lower half of a man's body showed on the ladder. Yashimoto frowned at the first lieutenant. "Tell him to stop that confounded noise until I have finished." Kagumi shouted up the conning tower, and the drilling stopped. Yashimoto said, "The engine room department makes excellent progress with the repairs. That is good, but they must not silence your captain." With a self-conscious grin, he cleared his throat and straightened his cap. All men not detailed for special duties will rest until 1830. Sunset, he added, will be at 1823. Working parties for tonight will be the same as they were in the early hours of this morning. Looking round at the tired, grubby faces, his manner softened. I realized that in this heat we would all like to swim, but that is not possible. Apart from the danger of sharks, nobody may go on deck during daylight hours unless sent by the duty officer. The risk of detection from the air is too great. Further reconnaissance by aircraft may not take place until late in the afternoon, but we cannot take chances. They may come at any time. He glanced at the sheet of notes on the chart table, went on, "Now an item of good news." Yashimoto's mouth smiled, but not his eyes. "The first lieutenant tells me that the Africans draw their water from a spring behind the huts. Tonight an inflatable goes across with empty drums. Tomorrow we wash ourselves and our clothing in fresh water. That will be a luxury." Not quite accurate, thought Sato. "We will wash our clothing, the wardroom steward will wash yours, but I do give you credit for having restricted yourself to the daily ration of 4 mugs of fresh water a day while we were on Pacific patrols." Yashimoto folded the sheet of notes, placed it in his shirt pocket. "That is all," he said. "You may carry on." Restless had rounded Cape Delgado and set out on the last leg to Rovuma Bay when radar reported an aircraft approaching from the north. Not long afterwards it could be seen ahead, the distant speck growing steadily larger. When close, the Catalina began to fly in a wide circle, the noise of its engines masking all other sounds, the boat like fuselage gleaming in the sunlight. Over his shoulder the captain called, "Make our pennant numbers, yeoman." The yeoman aimed an Aldis lamp and its shutter began to click. An answering light blinked from the aircraft. The yeoman passed the pennant numbers, the Catalina acknowledged, adding, "Any joy?" The yeoman repeated the message aloud. Barrett said, "Make, not yet, but getting warmer. Strict WT silence imperative. Please inform Captain Destroyers." The shutter of Restless's lamp chattered busily. The Catalina acknowledged with, "Will do. Can we assist?" Barrett shook his head emphatically as the yeoman repeated the message. "Make, thanks, but please keep clear. Your presence draws attention to us." With a final, "will do," the Catalina climbed away on a southerly course. In a quiet aside, Geoffrey Lawson, the officer of the watch who shared the bridge with Sean O'Brien, said, "Pretty unfriendly, weren't we? The only thing that is getting warmer is the weather." "Well, I would not be knowing about that, Jeff, but I think the old man's right in not wanting to advertise our whereabouts. In the western approaches we learnt." "Here we go again," interrupted Lawson. "And what was it we learnt in the western approaches?" O'Brien looked across to where the captain sat in his chair on the compass platform. "To keep a low profile if you hoped to find a submarine before it found you. Remember Max Horton's golden rule? Cut the cackle?" "I was not in the western approaches, and anyway he is Admiral Sir Max Horton to you, my lad." Lawson raised a disapproving eyebrow. "Never forget there are few more lowly forms of marine life than a Sub-Lieutenant Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve." "Ah, and that sounds like the good old Royal Navy," said O'Brien, one eye still on the captain. "But it's fine to know that some of us do it for the pleasure and not the money." The river had pushed a semicircle of brown silt far out into Rovuma Bay, and it was there that Restless reversed course and began her search to the south. The heat of an already oppressive day was tempered by a light breeze from the southeast, which rustled the surface of the glittering sea. A few miles to starboard, the coast showed thinly through the heat haze, the swell breaking on its offshore reefs, throwing up sheets of white foam which seemed to hang lazily in the air. With few exceptions, the men on deck, their bodies deeply tanned, wore only white shorts. To those on duty on the bridge, however, no such license was permitted. "I am not having a lot of half-nude gorillas on my bridge," Barrett had informed the first lieutenant on joining the ship in Colombo, thereby ending the dispensation granted by the previous captain. Cape Delgado was rounded an hour after leaving Rovuma Bay, and the destroyer's progress to the south became painstakingly slow. The many alterations of course and speed in the inshore passages between the islands and the mainland, and the stops to lower and recover the motorboat and skimmer, were responsible. The former was used to investigate promising islets and inlets, and the latter to question catamaran fishermen. For this task, Peter Morrow, armed with a photograph of a submarine, was proving invaluable. The recently joined sub-lieutenant, born and brought up in Kenya, was fluent in Kiswahili, the lingua franca of the coast Africans. This, combined with an easygoing manner, ensured his rapport with the fishermen. In the chart room, Dodds divided frowning attention between the plotting table where a stylus traced the destroyer's course through the channels between the islands and the mainland. Every reef and sandbank, every shoal and shallow for him a threat of imminent disaster, and the echo sounder which recorded the depths of water through which Restless passed, and finally the tide tables which served only to compound his worries. At noon, looking a vastly troubled man, he reported to the captain that average speed made good since Cape Delgado was only 6.3 knots. The captain was in a wing of the bridge examining an Arab dhow through binoculars. "Not bad, pilot," he said, "when you consider how we have been buggering about." With its lateen sail filled by the southeaster, the dhow was making up the coast in the narrow channel between the mainland and the islands off Cape Nondo, where mangrove swamps gave way to bush-clad slopes, which in turn led to a hilltop where a baobab tree stood in solitary grandeur. The captain lowered his binoculars, pointed to it. "See that?" he said. "I expect the skipper of that dhow uses it as a leading mark, just as his Arab ancestors have done for the last 1,000 years. Not bad for the old man, thought Charlie Dodds, almost poetic. "I expect so, sir," was his dutiful reply. By early afternoon, the pattern of the search had become established. The motorboat and skimmer were now no longer hoisted inboard on completion of a mission, experience having shown that time was saved if they were left in the water to follow Restless until needed to investigate. The destroyer's speed reduced to that of the motorboat, the slowest of the trio. Radar had been shut down after passing Cape Delgado on the journey south. To compensate for this, the number of lookouts had been doubled. When near the small port of Mochimboa da Praia, a northbound coaster was sighted by the masthead lookout. Barrett altered course to seaward to avoid being seen inshore, not that he was unduly worried on that account. The searching for survivors' story could always be used. Barrett was in the chart room when Duckworth arrived in person to deliver a signal from Captain Destroyers. "With WT silence, I could not acknowledge it," he explained as he handed it over. "Of course not, Duckworth. They will understand." Barrett read the signal and, with an exclamation of annoyance, put it in the chart room clip. Addressed to Restless, repeated Deputy Commander-in-Chief, it read, "Return here if no contact by sunset today." Barrett raged inwardly. How on earth could he be expected to complete a thorough search of the coast in the 12 hours which had elapsed since Kilindini's signal ordering it that morning? There were still 55 miles of coastline and islands to be checked before they reached Matimo Island, 20 miles off which Fort Nebraska had gone down. There were another 40 miles of coast south of that where a damaged submarine could have hidden. A worthwhile search was only possible in daylight. With almost 100 miles still to be done, at an average speed of about 6 knots, there was not a hope of finishing before sunset the following day. The whole thing was preposterous. He saw the hand of the SOO behind the recall signal. Russell did not like him. They were on different wavelengths, and he did not much like gloomy Russell for that matter. A dreary individual, decided Barrett. He suspected that the incident which had sparked mutual dislike had taken place soon after Restless arrived in Kilindini from Colombo with other units of the Eastern Fleet. He, Russell, and others had gone off to the flagship in the same motorboat. In accordance with custom, the coxswain had gone alongside the starboard gangway to disembark the captains of Restless and Resister, who were piped on board and saluted by the officer of the watch and his minions. Russell, though senior in rank to Barrett, had remained in the motorboat with several other officers until the coxswain took it round to the port gangway where they disembarked, their arrival on the quarterdeck not qualifying for the ceremonial pipe since they did not command ships. Later, on the return journey to the shore, Russell had remarked, somewhat sardonically, that using different gangways for officers arriving at and departing from the flagship in the same boat struck him as a monumental waste of time, particularly with a war on. Barrett had replied, "It is a very old custom, pre-Nelson in fact. Perhaps it has something to do with the scroll on the wall in the captain of the fleet's office?" "Oh, really? What?" "I am not sure of the exact wording, but approximately it reads, It is the custom of their lordships to give preference to those who serve at sea." Turning a gloomy eye on him, Russell had remained silent. Later, Barrett regretted the remark. As Staff Officer Operations, Russell was on the shore staff. Older than Barrett, and a good deal longer on the retired list, he was, notwithstanding his rank, less suitable for command. It was not surprising, therefore, that he had been given a shore job. Barrett knew this, and knew too that Russell was happy to be in Kilindini, not too far from his farm at Naivasha, whence his wife made her not infrequent visits to Mombasa. The incident had been trivial enough, but Barrett felt it was responsible for Russell's chilly manner. As for Restless's recall, he thought it likely that Captain Destroyers and the SOO had agreed that Catalinas could carry out a more effective search than a destroyer, and they were probably right, he conceded privately. But that was not going to change his plans. He had already made up his mind. Restless would not return to Kilindini until the search had been completed, nor would he break wireless silence to plead, argue, or explain. Something which Captain Destroyers and SU did not know, and would never know, was what the search meant to him. From the moment Corrigan had reported that the submarine was Japanese, Barrett's determination to hunt and find it had become an obsession. He had been presented with an opportunity to do something about what had happened to Caroline. For this reason, he no longer saw the submarine in the context of prosecuting the war against the enemy. It was much more than that, nothing less than a personal matter between himself and the Japanese. There had for a long time been in his mind an indelible image, the harsh face of the commandant of Changi Gale. The image persisted, but the face now was that of the commander of the Japanese submarine. And because the imagery was a product of hatred, the face was not a pleasant one. By late afternoon there was to Barrett's tired eyes a wearying sameness about the coastline and its islands, blue seas lapping dazzling white beaches fringed with coconut palms, the higher ground bush clad with clumps of indigenous trees overlooked at times by feathery casuarina trees. On the seaward side of the islands the surf curled and foamed where the swells broke on the reefs. There were glimpses of palm-thatched native huts, the only other signs of human activity the catamarans fishing off the reefs. The water was so transparent in the shallows that rocks and coral reefs could be seen from the bridge, dark shapes against the sandy bottom where shafts of sunlight danced to the music of the sea. In the skimmer, Peter Morrow had got the average time of interrogation down to a few minutes per catamaran. "It is a fine art," he had explained to anyone prepared to listen during a snatched sandwich in the wardroom at midday. You flash the photograph, say, "Seen one of these?" The African stares at it, shakes his head, grins and offers you a fish. You refuse politely, saying, "May your catamaran bear many fish and your wives many children." With these courtesies done, you open the throttle and speed away. The whole thing takes just under 3 minutes. I need a beer, Docker. What about you? But as the hours passed and the motorboat and skimmer bustled about their respective duties, their reports uniformly negative, Barrett's spirits sagged and the enthusiasm of the morning gave way to disenchantment. Of course they would never find the wretched submarine. Why had he ever thought they would? Even if it could not dive, the places to hide were so many, it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. The engineer officer, Gareth Edwards, who'd served in submarines, had not helped Barrett's mood when he came to the bridge in the afternoon. In the course of a discussion, he had pointed out that a hole in the conning tower did not necessarily mean a submarine could not dive. "With the lower hatch shut," he explained, "you can dive. The hold conning tower itself becomes a free-flooding area, but you can trim the boat to look after that. Surely there must be some problems, chiefly, with a ruddy great hole in the conning tower." Edwards said, "Yes, indeed. The surfacing drill is affected, and crash dives are not practical, but neither of these prevent the boat from diving. They are what you might call operational inconveniences." Barrett had not chosen to answer, but his resolve had remained unshaken. He would stick to his instinct. For him, the deciding factor was the massacre of Fort Nebraska's survivors. If the Japanese submarine could dive, what was the point of that senseless annihilation? So the search went on, and would go on, if necessary, until nightfall on the following day. Towards sunset, a Catalina was sighted some distance away. Flying low over the islands, heading north, it turned towards Restless as it came closer. A few minutes later, it had passed about a quarter of a mile away to port. Barrett watched the flying boat through binoculars, annoyed that it had come so close, but it neither circled nor attempted to signal, and he was grateful for that. Soon afterwards, there was a heavy rainstorm which drenched the bridge and everybody on it, but since it lowered the temperature and countered the oppressive heat, it was more than welcome. Hutch Hutchison put down the phone. The duty officer at base says Catalina Freddie Orange's estimated time of arrival is 22:05. It will have covered the coast between here and Port Amelia on both the outward and return legs. He looked at the clock above the wall chart. Let us see. Time 1800 hours. It should sight Restless soon if she is still in the Cape Delgado area. The SOO said, "If is the operative word. It would be interesting to know exactly what Barrett meant by not yet but getting warmer." Captain Destroyers blew his nose noisily. Presumably means that he was onto some sort of clue. But what sort? That is the $64 question. Any ideas, Haddingham? Jim Haddingham, a lieutenant commander on Captain Destroyer's staff, was flotilla navigating officer. "Not much in the way of hiding places between Rovuma Bay and Cape Delgado," he said, "but the chart shows plenty of possibilities south of the Cape." The SOO stroked his chin with thumb and forefinger. His request to the Catalina to keep clear because it was drawing attention to Restless. He looked at Captain Destroyers. "What do you make of that? Pretty obvious, isn't it? He did not want attention drawn to Restless's presence." The SOO looked unconvinced. Presumably anybody who could see the Catalina circling was likely to have seen Restless anyway. Captain Destroyers shook his head. "Not necessarily, Russell. A submarine concealed behind an island or in a creek might see the aircraft circling without being able to see what it was circling over. If the aircraft's signal lamp was flashing, he had known it was talking to a surface vessel." He turned to Haddingham. "You and Barrett were at Dartmouth together. What sort of chap is he? I know him as a reliable, but—" He pursed his lips. "Let us say a run-of-the-mill destroyer captain, but then he has only been with us since we got here and ceased to operate as a flotilla." "He is an odd sort of a chap," said the flotilla navigating officer. "Not the type one noticed much in those days. Quiet, a bit bookish, did not shine at games, though he was a good cross-country runner. Used to enter for them all and win them all." "I can believe that," Captain Destroyers nodded understandingly. "He's one of those gaunt, wiry types. They usually are good runners." Haddingham waited for Captain Destroyers to finish before saying, "It was later that he began to be noticed, I suppose." "In what way?" Captain Destroyer's head was cocked on one side. He was inclined to be accident-prone, ran into bits of trouble, odd sorts of scrapes. For example, as a sub-lieutenant in destroyers, he got involved in a mock duel with a midshipman in Valletta, fought it out on the iron deck with very pistols. Both young men rather tight. One of the very flares landed in the stern sheets of a motorboat coming alongside the starboard gangway. The captain's dinner guests were in it. So was the captain. Captain Destroyers chuckled. "He was not amused, I dare say. Anything else?" "Other incidents of that sort, you know. Usually after he had had a few drinks. He wrecked a pin table in a Chatham pub on one occasion. Told the publican that a notice on the machine invited payment of 6pence in return for 3 playing balls. He pointed out that it had jammed and failed to deliver the balls, although it had got his 6pence. The gross breach of contract had, he said, compelled him to take steps to recover the 6pence. Haddingham laughed. The pub keeper reported him, and the story got into the local press. Captain Destroyers looked mildly surprised. "He does not strike me as that sort of man. Rather quiet, I thought. He left the service as a lieutenant, didn't he?" Haddingham said, "Yes, he did. With about 6 years between his stripes. He had a frightful car smash when his ship was in Portsmouth, coming back from a hunt ball somewhere in the country. A cabinet minister's daughter was his passenger. Her face was badly cut up. The police said he had been drinking. There was a hell of a row. He left the service not long afterwards, went into the family wine business. That was a few years before the war began." "Shouldn't have thought the family wine business was the best place." Captain Destroyers was lost in thought. "I suppose most of us did some rather stupid things when we were young. Bad luck, though, that car accident, both for the girl and his naval career." "There were other scrapes. He was, as I have said, accident-prone." continued Haddingham, but to his credit he was popular with the lower deck, very good with them, always ready to help men in trouble, never threw his rank about. The SOO fanned himself with a signal pad. You seem to know a lot about him. I got to know him well in the training cruiser, and later on the subs course at Greenwich. He was an amusing chap and a good friend. Never let you down. I liked him. He was a funny mix, half quiet and reserved, half rather wild. Our paths crossed several times after that. The SOO said, I have always wondered how he got command of a fleet destroyer. Captain Destroyers said, I know the answer to that. Made a name for himself at Dunkirk. Got his Distinguished Service Cross there. The V&W he commanded shot down a couple of aircraft and took off a lot of people. I see. The SOO looked gloomily through the open French windows down to Kilindini harbour, where the long stretch of water reflected the light of the setting sun and the camouflaged hulls of warships at anchor. An interested spectator of the day's events was Brad Corrigan. Wearing white shorts from the ship's clothing store, he spent most of the day on deck watching the comings and goings of the motorboat and skimmer, gleaning something of what was happening from scraps of conversation around him. The American's bloodshot eyes, the scratches on his face and upper body, were reminders of the long night in the water. Apart from these, he seemed in good shape. Convinced by what he had seen that night, he did not believe the submarine could have dived. For him, the search made sense. He admired the thorough way in which it was being conducted and had a burning desire to be involved. He would have liked to be in the skimmer, the outboard engine screaming its head off, and its propeller throwing up plumes of white foam as it leapt and bounced over the sea. His interest had been heightened by the low-flying Catalinas, the sound of their engines deafening as they flew overhead. All in all, he reckoned the Limeys were doing a good job. If they did not find the Japanese, it would not be for want of trying. Sometime soon, he reckoned, he would request to see the captain again. Ask him, could not he, Corrigan, maybe go along in the skimmer and lend a hand? The captain seemed okay. A hard face, but when he smiled it changed a lot, made him look a nice guy. There is no one in the ship can want to find that submarine the way I do, soliloquized Corrigan. Sure, I have got a grudge. Yeah, a real bad grudge. I saw them annihilating my buddies, didn't I? Gunning them down like they were animals. That adds up to one hell of a good reason for wanting to get stuck into them. I will put it to the captain that way. Maybe he will understand. Give me the okay to go along. I need to get into that act real bad. When the sun had gone and the twilight glow in the western sky had given way to night, the motorboat returned to Restless. The gunnery officer who'd taken it away put in the negative report that had become all too customary. Barrett had shrugged, concealed his disappointment. We will tackle the southern section tomorrow, he said. It looks promising on the chart. More islands and broken coastline than we have had today. Now that we have got into the routine, it should. The shrill voice of the starboard lookout broke into the sentence. Skimmer approaching, sir. Ahead to starboard. It could not be seen in the gathering gloom, but the high-pitched whine of its engine grew steadily louder. Moving through the water at slow speed, Restless showed no lights until the chief boatswain's mate directed the beam of his torch onto the sea. The skimmer came out of the darkness, manoeuvred alongside, and was hoisted on board. Morrow ran up to the bridge, found the captain on the compass platform. Sorry, sir, no joy, he said. There is a lot to be done yet. Barrett spoke quietly, did not lower his binoculars. We are only halfway. Morrow thought the captain sounded despondent, almost as if he did not really mean what he was saying. Barrett decided that Restless should stand out to sea that night. With revolutions for 15 knots and radar and ASDIC operating, the destroyer settled down on a 15-mile patrol line, 3 miles to seaward of the islands of Tambuzi and Metundo, the light on the former in sight most of the time. Sometime after 8 o'clock, satisfied that the ship was on station, he handed over the bridge to Geoffrey Lawson. After a modest meal in his sea cabin, he made his first attempt at sleep in the 24 hours since Restless had picked up Fort Nebraska's signal. To Barrett it seemed a good deal longer. Exhausted and depressed, he lay on the settee, turning constantly, the pillow moist with sweat, the humid heat too much for the fan which whirred above his head. Sleep just would not come. Too many thoughts in his head. Through it kept passing pictures of all that had happened during those 24 hours. Inevitably, they were accompanied by questions and uncertainties. Was he carrying out the search in the most efficient manner? Was there anything more he could and should be doing? Closer cooperation with the Catalinas? Why? In what way? They were searching as thoroughly as they could. So was Restless. The only sort of cooperation possible was the exchange of more signals. With what object? There was nothing to say. To have aircraft circling and flashing messages morning and evening was a sure way of making a nonsense of the search. Captain Destroyer's signal? Surely to God the operations room could not imagine there'd been enough time to complete the search. They have got bloody great charts, he told himself. The Catalinas will have reported where we were AM and PM, so they know the approximate rate of our search. Why call it off less than halfway through? Can't they see from the chart that the Japanese is just as likely to have looked for a hideout to the south of Fort N's sinking position as to the north? Tired though he was, he could formulate only one response to these conjectures and rhetorical questions. Restless's search would continue. Only if the southern section yielded nothing by the end of the following day would he set course for Mombasa. To call a halt now was as unthinkable as it was indefensible. A dialogue with Caroline took shape in his mind. "But why did you give up halfway?" she was saying. "Because of the signal. Captain Destroyers ordered me to return." With a small frown, a lifting of the eyebrows, she said, "But surely you did not have to answer. W/T silence and all that. You could have gone on, could not you? And disobeyed orders? Why not? Nelson did. He said he could not see the signal. You could say you had not received it. So I let you down. That is for your conscience to decide. I do not know. I am dead." And so the interminable mental wrangle had gone on, and her "why not?" Nelson did, kept repeating itself until, at long last, he fell asleep. But for a gentle roll, an occasional creak in the superstructure and the distant murmur of machinery, there was little indication in the wardroom that Restless was at sea. The few officers there were reading, talking, or idling in other ways. One of them, the engineer officer, sat on a settee, hands clasped behind his head, legs stretched out in front of him. He made a second attempt to get the doctor's attention. "And what would be the important book that so engrosses the doctor?" he asked, the sing-song Welsh accent exaggerated for the occasion. The doctor looked up, frowned. "It is a scholarly work by a German gentleman," he said. "You would not have read him." "Ah, and which one might that be?" The Welshman covered a yawn with a large hand. "Thomas Mann, maybe, or Mr. Einstein. Number from its title you might conclude that I have here a treatise on constipation, but it is not so, though some might describe the work as related to that complaint." "Mein Kampf," came from a fair man with a square face who was playing chess with a midshipman. The square face belonged to Andrew Weeks, a Lieutenant Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve who had graduated from Oxford not long before the war began. The doctor turned to look at him. "Very good, Andy. Nothing like a classical education. And now, for $100, my next question. Who was the author?" Midshipman Galpin's hand went up. "Adolf Hitler, sir." "You were not asked, precocious youth." The doctor frowned, went back to his book. The torpedo officer, John Taylor, a small thin man with black crinkly hair and dark eyes, threw a last dart at the board before slumping into an armchair next to the sprawling figure of Sandy Hamilton, who opened an eye to see who the newcomer was. Taylor said, "Sorry if I have disturbed you." Number 1. "Not at all. It is a pleasure. One always enjoys being disturbed, particularly when dreaming." The first lieutenant shifted his legs and rearranged himself in the chair. "Camilla, was it?" suggested Taylor. "Officers and gentlemen do not discuss ladies in the wardroom. Sorry, Number 1. I must apologize for the lapse." The torpedo officer's sigh was exaggerated. "She is very beautiful." "Pipe down, little man. That is enough." Taylor smiled. "Now that you're awake, may I ask you a question?" "Yes, if it is not about politics, religion, or women." Taylor leant towards the first lieutenant, lowered his voice. "A bit odd that the old man has ignored Captain Destroyer's signal, isn't it?" "What do you mean?" There was a cautionary note in the first lieutenant's reply. "You know what I mean. Sunset was 2 hours ago. We have not the slightest clue where the ruddy submarine is, and yet here we are farting up and down a patrol line when we should be legging it for Mombasa." The first lieutenant, his eyes on the chess players, did not reply. Slowly, and with some effort, he levered himself out of the armchair, yawned and stretched. Taylor said, "You have not answered my question. Number 1. The first lieutenant stared at him. "I am not in the business of criticizing the captain's decisions," he said. "Nor should you be." He looked round the wardroom, tapped his mouth to hide another yawn. "I think I will turn in," he announced to no one in particular as he went to the door. He too wondered what the captain was up to. It was not long before the voice pipe on the bulkhead above Barrett's pillow whistled him awake. It was the officer of the watch. "Captain, bridge, radar contact, small target, dead ahead, bearing steady, range 8 miles, closing slowly." "Good. I will be up in a second." Barrett rolled off the settee, blinked at the single red light allowed in his sea cabin, looked at the time, course and speed indicators on the bulkhead, and set off for the bridge. Small target was probably a coaster, but it could equally be a surfaced submarine. Dead ahead, bearing steady and closing slowly, meant it was on the same course as the destroyer which was overtaking. It was some time before the range had closed sufficiently for the AS cabinet to classify the target as a small ship, single screw, reciprocating engine. So it was not a submarine, nor were several other reports that brought Barrett to the bridge that night. By sunset, I-357's crew were ready for another night of hard work. Rested and refreshed, most of them having slept through the afternoon, there was much chattering and laughter as they made ready their equipment before going ashore. There was now an addition to their ranks. Kasuki, the man who had received a head wound from a shell splinter, had been passed fit by the coxswain. With a bandage round his head, the young able seaman was questioned by the navigating officer to whom he had expressed his keenness to join the shore party. "I feel good," he told Sato, who, with the first lieutenant's permission, then detailed him to work with the carrying party. In accordance with Yashimoto's orders, the forenoon had been devoted to cleaning up the submarine below decks. The results were remarkable. The litter had gone from compartments which had been washed down and made shipshape enough for an admiral's inspection. The foul smells of rotting food and hot unwashed bodies had given way to those of disinfectant, tinged with the ever-present odour of diesel oil. The foliage spread over I-357 made conditions on board more tolerable than they would otherwise have been. Open hatches and sea breezes from the creek blowing through the different compartments did much to check the high temperatures of the tropics. The excellence of the crew's morale was in part due to this, but in the main it came from the knowledge that a dangerous situation had been averted. The captain had found a safe hiding place. The repairs to the conning tower were going ahead, and enemy aircraft had failed to spot the submarine. In a few days they would be putting to sea again, bound for Penang with all the pleasures and comforts that promised. For this they had to thank their captain, a man for whom they had the greatest respect. He was, they knew, a highly efficient naval officer, calm under all conditions, however difficult and dangerous. They saw him as someone who always acted decisively, always made the right decisions. They knew they were lucky to have a man like Commander Togo Yashimoto as their captain. It increased the chances of survival in a service in which few survived. Throughout the day, the sounds of hammering and the whine of high-speed drills came from the conning tower where the repair party under Hayato Shimada, the chief engine room artificer, worked with unremitting effort. Lack of space restricted the number of men who could be in the conning tower at any one time. To offset the heat in that confined space, they were relieved at intervals by men who had been resting. The work having begun soon after I-357 arrived in the creek, the initial task of dismantling was well advanced. The aircraft alarm signal was sounded twice during the afternoon. In mid-afternoon, the first Catalina came in from the south. The second came from the north an hour or so later. But on this occasion it had been noted by a sentry that the Catalinas had different identification letters. The presence of 2 aircraft over the islands was to Yashimoto evidence of unusual air activity. Was this because the British suspected that I-357 was hiding somewhere on the coast? Or was it for some other reason, such as searching for survivors? He inclined towards the latter. The southbound Catalina, which arrived in late afternoon, flew low over the creek, skimming the trees on the summits of the surrounding hills. It had climbed away, its engines screaming, turned steeply and then flown back along the length of the creek, after which it continued its journey to the south. Worried as he was by its apparent interest in Creek Island, Yashimoto congratulated himself on the steps he had taken to conceal the submarine. He acknowledged to himself, however, that the configuration of the creek also helped. Less than 700 yards long, most of it little more than 100 wide, much of it shadowed by the steep slopes of the surrounding hills, it was no easy target for observation from an aircraft which could be over it for no more than fractions of a minute. After the working parties had gone ashore, Yashimoto and the engineer officer met in the wardroom to discuss the progress of repairs. They sat together at the wardroom table, drawings of the conning tower and its casing before them. To smoke was a luxury not permitted below decks under normal conditions, but with fresh air now passing freely through the boat, they were enjoying cheroots which had been bought by the captain in Penang. Satogawa was explaining the problems involved in carrying out the work. "Nothing has been easy," he said. The armor-piercing shell, it was probably a 5.5 inch, having passed through the outer casing, penetrated the wall of the conning tower at its junction with the main pressure hull before bursting. That has left a large jagged hole at the point where the two surfaces meet at an acute angle. It also destroyed most of the starboard side of the lower hatch coaming. This makes the repairs very difficult. We have to restore the integrity of the main pressure hull and rebuild the lower hatch. Damaged air pressure pipes and electric circuits have also to be repaired. We have cut away most of the broken steel. Next, we have to make a start on patching the pressure hull and conning tower and rebuilding the lower hatch. To do this, we have to cannibalize other parts of the boat without weakening the structure. It is a long, slow business. Finally, there is the damaged hatch lid itself. Removing it has taken longer than expected. The engineer officer's tone became apologetic. It is a heavy steel fitting, designed to withstand great pressure. The explosion put exceptional stresses on the lugs to the hinges. This distorted them and also the hinge pins. To remove them, we have had to drill and chisel before getting the lid out for straightening and repair of the hinges. Soon we will make a start on cutting and bending 3/8 steel plating to fit over the shell holes, then bolt them into place. Reconstruction of the tower hatch and hatch lid and shaping the steel plating will require very high temperatures. We do not have a furnace on board, but we can set up something ashore. Build it with stones, fuel it with dry timber and diesel oil, and use compressed air cylinders to blow it since we have not got bellows. That was the chief engine room artificer's idea. All this will take time. Many hours will be required to achieve the temperatures necessary. The steel must be worked while it is white hot. This will involve constant reheating and measurement controls. Since we do not have the equipment of a foundry, there will have to be a lot of improvisation, a process of trial and error, learning as we go, so to speak. The line of Yashimoto's mouth hardened. "I cannot accept failure," he said decisively. "I must have your assurance that the work can be done." Satogawa avoided the captain's penetrating stare. "It can be done," he said, "but it is difficult to estimate how long it will take." Yashimoto pursed his lips, exhaled, his eyes on the smoke ring climbing to the deckhead. "Today is the 21st of November. He spoke slowly, very deliberately, as if each word was being weighed. "We have been ordered to take up station outside Mombasa not later than midnight on the 25th. The carrier and its escorts are due on the 26th or 27th. The journey to Mombasa will take 2 days. To be on station in time, we must leave here by midnight on the 23rd. Can you get the work done by then, Chief?" Yashimoto's pouched eyes bore into the engineer officer, who held up his hands as if fending off an attack. "If we fail," Satogawa lifted his shoulders in a gesture of doubt, "it can only be because we have attempted the impossible." Aware of the ambiguity, he quickly added, "I do not believe we are attempting the impossible." Yashimoto took the cheroot from his mouth, examined its burning end before tipping the ash into a saucer. "The fitting of outboard engines to the catamarans. Any problems there?" Satogawa at once relaxed. The change of subject appeared to please him. "There is no problem, Captain. The work will be completed before daylight. Of that you need have no doubt." Yashimoto nodded approval, his eyes on a picture of the Emperor hanging on the wardroom bulkhead. "Good," he said. "The catamarans will be less likely to attract attention from the air than inflatables,